individual improvements that I would consider capital in nature, and I guess I mention that because I think once we get the capital improvements plan in a better form, I would like to come back with a financing plan as a part of that, which may require amendment to this budget, depending on the timing of the activities that we propose. But in the interim, we've included funding for additional improvements to the Memorial Hall of about $150,000, animal shelter of about $40,000, and the switchboards in the jail and juvenile hall of about $400,000. In order to make the budget match in terms of available funding and revenue, we've introduced a factor of vacancy in the three major general fund or general fund related budget units, the general fund itself, the public safety fund, and probation. And the way we've done that is at a fund level rather than at the budget unit level. And we looked at the last 3 years of actual vacancy versus budgeted. And so in other words, how many positions did we actually have filled on a fund basis versus how many did we budget? Those ranged in those three budget units from 92% to 94% filled positions. And so conservative over the last 3 years. So conservatively, what we did is we factored a vacancy in the general fund of, correct me if I'm wrong, Julie, 3% in general fund, 4% in public safety, and 2.5% in probation. And the reason that we were more conservative in probation is that in addition to that vacancy factor, we're also showing some reductions in positions in the juvenile hall, particularly in probation. So those are factored in, and those total about $450,000, those vacancy factors. That will require that at mid-year that we come back and revisit that issue and see if we're true to our expectations, and if not, make adjustments to those budgets. But I'm confident that we will meet those vacancy factors given the current staffing levels and the current vacancies.
Richard, that was your proposed budget, that was figured in?
That's included. That is included in my recommended budget. We also removed the contingency line item, which is budgeted at $400,000. That had historically been budgeted in the general fund. We moved that to the general reserve, and that's hopefully funds that we will not need, but in the event that we do, they're budgeted in the general reserve rather than the general fund. Significant reductions in revenue, our projected revenue, are mainly in the form of property taxes, and that's due to a couple reasons. One, the reduction in the assessed valuation based on the date of January 1st, 2014. We're hoping that is the bottom of the assessed valuation for this cycle, and following years we'll see increases. It's also due largely to the fact that we received a large payment from Dyer Mountain last year that would be included in last year's revenues. And so when you look at this year's actual or estimated actual revenues versus our projected secured property tax revenues for next year, you'll see a pretty significant decrease. In terms of the format of the budget, we have changed things just a little bit and added a column. If you look at your recommended budget in the fund, at the fund level, you'll notice the prescribed format is the estimated fund balance plus the estimated revenues, and then on the available funding side, and then you'll see department requests in one column, my recommendation, and then a projected ending fund balance, which would be the sum of the beginning balances, estimated revenues, minus the recommended expenditures would be the projected ending balance. I've added a column to the right of that indicates the projected change in the fund balance, and that's mostly what you see in red. So, you will, getting back to the vacancy factor, we included it in those three main funds, or general fund, effective fund. We did not include that in Health and Human Services, although we expect to see similar vacancies in those funds, which will result in higher fund balances that are expressed in our recommendation. But we didn't include the actual reduction in appropriation because those are offset by revenues, and so to the extent that we have the expense, we'll realize the revenue. Before Julie takes over, I'd like to just identify a couple of things that I think are worth consideration now or at the budget hearings we have in a few weeks, but maybe just to point out a couple of things that I think we may consider. One would be the implementation of the 1265 Williamson Act. That's not included in, actually it's erroneously included in one of the schedules here. We'll be deducting that, but it's not in effect. The 1265 is not in effect, and we won't be realizing any offset from the Williamson Act. That may be something that the board wishes to consider for future years. Last year resulted in about 75,000-ish in revenue. This year we won't. The board also, I think, and has discussed at the budget committee meetings, the implementation of fees that would more accurately reflect the cost of some of the services we're providing. Some of those may be controversial, some not. Some of those would involve fees for electronic monitoring at the jail, for example, or concealed weapons permits, and that's kind of the range of how controversial they may be. But there are fees throughout the county that we could visit that don't currently reflect the true cost of providing the service. As far as economic development, we've kind of quantified what the annual subsidy of that division is now, and it's significant. I think that division began, whenever it began with the notion that it would be somewhat self-funding through CDBG grants, home grants, other sorts of grants, maybe with some subsidy with the transient occupancy tax, but it's grown to a point where it's a significant general fund contribution, and I think we might want to visit the magnitude of how much we're...
How much is that magnitude?
It's roughly about $300,000 this year, and part of that is operational, part of that is simply the liability that the activities expose the county to, and some of those we'll be discussing and probably settling over the course of the next year. So when we are in the business of being a lender, there are liabilities associated with that, and we're going to experience some expense related to that.
So the 350 or whatever is just the cost to run the program, and then in addition, we may have
Yes.
some other.
Incur some other costs.
Some of those liabilities are pretty hard to quantify until the judge pounds his gavel, so we don't really know. One accounting issue I wanted to discuss with the board surrounds the PILT funding, and so if I can get this out accurately, the federal fiscal year begins October 1st and September 31st. And I'm going to use 2013 as an example. The 2014 federal fiscal year begins October 1st. In that 2014 year, the federal budget appropriates funds for the payment in lieu of taxes for counties, which are received then the following June, in June of 2014. That has become a very significant funding source for the general fund. It's almost $1.8 million that we received. Now, historically, the county has taken the position that money will not be accrued until after July, for example I'm using, until after July 1st of 2014. So in other words, we get $1.8 million in June. We recognize that in our cash balances, but we do not recognize it in the fund balances that you see for budgetary purposes. So if you were to look at our general fund that indicates a balance of 400,000, the beginning balance, it's actually more like 2.7 million. There's a couple other factors in there, but the cash balance is actually more like 2.7 million when we begin the year. Now, my conversations with the auditor are that we have a choice that, and I'm not clear on whether that's the board's choice or the auditor's choice, but there's a choice to be made as to how you accrue that money, as to whether it's accrued in the following year or the year that it's received. I would kind of favor a situation where we accrue the portion of the money that is attributable to the period, which in my view would be, if 3/4 of that federal fiscal year is gone, 3/4 of the money would be attributable to that 13-14 county year, and the other quarter to the following year. But that's a debate I think maybe we could spend some time on at some point, because when you look at our cash balances, they're significantly higher at the year end than what our budgetary fund balances are, and I think that contributes to some confusion, so for what it's worth.
Well, Mr. Chairman, if I could weigh in, I'd like to weigh in on that one for a brief bit. I don't think it creates any confusion. I think it creates more misunderstandings, because when you start off the year, and this has been, I think, a historical perspective, we have a tendency of underestimating our revenues and overestimating our expenditures. Therefore, we're upside down and backwards, so we take drastic action to, adjust the budgets accordingly, affecting programs and affecting jobs and affecting people's lives. And then that's at the beginning of the cycle. And then at the end of the cycle, when things, pan out or play through, we find ourselves underspending our budgets, which is historically by nature a good thing to encourage. I think our staff has always been good at holding the line, because of the fact that the money you don't have is going to, at some point, somebody's going to probably get their job and be laid off because there's no money. And then the funds that we thought we weren't going to get all of a sudden are there, and now all of a sudden the numbers, and so it's that counterbalance back and forth. We need to find a way to moderate in that. And what the schools have done, and the PILT funds are very much like the old Forest Reserve funds used to be to the schools and roads, is kind of a general fund a source. Originally, when that program was generated by the Nixon Ford administrations and Congress back in the 70s, to recognize the fact that we have federal lands in our jurisdiction that don't generate any taxes, so that's payment of taxes. It came up with a formula that was per acre how much would be generated in terms of the revenue source. Congress historically had always underfunded that, even though the formula is there and we're supposedly entitled to X number of dollars. They would give us sometimes 20 cents on the dollar, and we never knew from year to year what they were going to give us. But historically, we were lucky if we saw 40 cents on the dollar. And so when you're expecting $1 million, you have $1 million for it in terms of acreage, 40 cents on the dollar, you might get, $400,000, $500,000. And that was kind of retained. And what the schools were doing with their Forest Reserve money is, instead of spending the money ahead of time and wait for it to come, hoping that it comes in, not knowing what Congress is going to do, they would take the money that they received in, say, June or July of this year, and they would sit on it for a year, and it would become the program base for the following year. So that if there was all of a sudden the bottom fell out, they had the ability to adjust and do it over a 12 or 15 or 18 month period of time. And so we as a county, and I think it was true of most counties, kind of moved into that same kind of a format. But starting in the 90s, during the Clinton years, in Congress we started seeing them funding more and more, and I think it was partly due to the aggressive lobbying that took place by NACO, our National Association of Counties, and the Western Interstate Region, which is a subgroup of NACO, which pretty much is all the counties west of the Mississippi. And Brian Dolly actually served as the president of that group back in, I want to say, around 2002 or 2003. So with the demise of the Forest Reserve formula and the emergence of the Secure Rules school funding, which was kind of like the replacement mechanism for providing funding. You know, there's been a lot of lobbying back in Washington trying to restore some of those dollars, particularly with the demise of the timber industry. And I think part of the benefit of that lobbying has been the fact that Congress recognizes, you know, that this full funding formula is there, that they've always shortchanged it. But historically, our staff, and I would say this goes back a number of years, have always budgeted, you know, as a baseline, $400,000 or $500,000, and maybe if we're lucky, or that's what we can expect reasonably for our PILT contributions. And if we get an amount greater than that, all of a sudden everybody freezes up and says, you know, there's got to be something wrong. And we're so used to the state of California, when there's a mistake made, of taking the money back. So instead of recognizing the money as being something that's available for us to use, we wind up budgeting what we know is the safe amount, which is that baseline funding, and we put the balance in some sort of a suspense account, pending, you know, maybe after 3 years, if they don't ask for the money back, then maybe it was real, then the money becomes available. We used to always refer to that as Bixby's black box. He had all these little pots hanging around, and we never had any money to do anything, but when something came up that had to be done, he seemed to have a black box that he could reach in, and oftentimes it was these kind of funds. This is one of several that are like that. Well, with the Bush administration, we kept seeing that amount growing, and I think with the collapse of the economy in 2008, as the federal government was looking at ways of moving funds to the localities to spend, to try to generate and reboot and restart the economy in a big way, the PILT became one of those tubes that they could drop money down. And starting, you know, in about 2009, and if you look at the numbers that are on the show where the revenues that come in for the PILT, I mean, back in 2010-11, we were receiving 1.1, 1.2 million. Now we're up to 1.8 million. So they're putting down not only 100% of the funding we're seeing, and that's money that comes shooting right now. How long that is going to remain remains to be seen, but there has been a clear pattern of these increases in the formulas being funded and the money's coming in. And that, all that does is accommodate us. If we don't recognize it as being legitimate, genuine revenue, you know, it starts piling up and we get more money than, you know, it's sitting there. It's not that it's part of the revenue stream. So one of the things that I really think is important, Richard, that we do, and we haven't had this, I do notice there's it's under tab 1, it's this sheet right here that is new in the budget, which I was surprised to see, but glad to see. And this follows the 2 pages that you're looking at right here. And it does give us what our fund balances are. And the question is how much of that fund balance is legitimate and reasonable to be used as it relates to our fiscal year. So, you know, whether the PILT, you know, we have 3/4 of this fiscal year is based on the PILT payment, you know, do we legitimately budget 3/4 of the PILT payment to cover that? I have no problem with us doing that, but I have a problem with the fact that we lose track of the quarters or the amounts that we set aside as a reserve. So we should have a fund balance that are accurate, we should have fund balances that are available, and then if we don't take it all, like in the case of PILT, we only budget 3/4 of it to use, because that's legitimately what's available that pertains to this fiscal year, fine. Then the balance that we hold in abeyance, you know, that we're pending some subsequent action. I like to see a chart or a table that quantifies that, because when I listen to the rhetoric that we're broke, okay, yeah, you know, we've got money that we've been accumulating on the side because it's money that comes to us unexpectedly or is in a larger measure than what we're accustomed to, and we're convinced that there's going to be some government action to try to take the money back, or at least portions of it, so we hold it in reserve. And we wait until such a time as you know, the coast is clear and none of the agencies want it back, and then we declare the money is free and good, and we go ahead and use it. A good example was back in the 90s, and we were ready to go bankrupt. I mean, we weren't going to have enough money, and all of a sudden we received, the auditor did, Irene Doyle was the auditor, it was like $1.1 million for some welfare payment for one particular month, and we're county number 18 in the numbering of counties. Los Angeles County is county number 19. And so when they were punching the key, it hit 19. So 1 month's payment for LA County was, you know, 2 years worth of funding for Lassen County. And so we had this check, And it was, I think it was designed to get us to squawk, because it was back when Pete Wilson and Willie Brown were raising the ERAF, the funds. So what does Irene do with this? I mean, you can send the check back. And so that $1 million check, which was obviously a mistake, because it's not something that we were entitled to, was put into one of these accounts as an advance. And it sat there for 7 or 8 years before the controller's office finally determined that we had this overpayment that we tried to tell them that they had back then, but they didn't. And in the meantime, we generated a fair amount of interest. And the good news is they got their $1 million back. We had our cash flow, and we were able to keep the interest in doing that. So those are the kind of games that oftentimes are played with some of these funds. But the problem is, when I look at this sheet that Richard or Julie, whoever generated it, and it shows, and I'm talking about the totals here on the bottom. At one point, our estimated fund balance, these are the accumulated monies from before we even get to new revenues. We've got $26 million, and we have estimated revenues of $97 million, and now we have total available funds of $123 million, a fund, a budget of being requested of $107 million. The CAO is recommending we have a budget of $104 million, which means that the projected fund balance is going to be $19 million, which means that we're utilizing $6.8 million of this previously accumulated amount. Well, some people will say, oh God, we're $6.8 million, we're deficit spending. Well, we're deficit spending if we don't have the $26 million, but we've got literally 25% of our operating funds or operating budgets already sitting there before we even start collecting another tax dollar or whatever. And that is a revenue, that is funds that should be available. And if it's a case where we can't touch it, why do we have it? Why don't we just give it back to the people? So that is the basis of the rhetoric that I've offered in recent years about the fact that we have a lot of money laying around on the table to work with. But we only choose to work with some of that money, and we create this illusion that we are in really tough times. Well, 10 years ago, we didn't have $26 million sitting there to fund a $100 million budget to start with. And sure, if we're having to fund $104 million based on $97 million, we've got some serious issues that we have to address. But we have rat hole, or like a squirrel, collected the nuts, and we have $26 million above and beyond the $97 million worth of projected revenue coming in. So resource-wise, we have a lot more to work with. And what I'd like to see us do is, how much of that is truly available? I'm not saying we have $26 million, we can go out and do whatever we want to today. There are some caveats that relate to that. So I think that's what I'm talking about, the fund balances that are held in advance. Instead of having them just kind of out of sight, out of mind, I want to see them quantified. So if we're going to take, like say, PIL, $1.8 million, and 3/4 of that is really what pertains to this fiscal year, with the 3/4 that overlaps, and we budget the 3/4. And I want to clearly see another one of these charts, which is similar to this one, which identifies what are the funds that are being held in advance that we have received in previous years that's sitting out there that could be available to us. That includes our Teeter money, that includes a whole bunch, it includes our Trindle money, how much we have invested in Trindle, how much have we been overinvested, how much we may potentially have coming back. I see we're booking that we're going to get $100,000 rebate coming back. I mean, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, it was like 1.3 or 4 million that we got back. So that, I think, is something I'm sure that the Budget Committee addressed. If they didn't, it's something they should have been addressing. I don't see that really reflected in the minutes or in the recommendations, but I have definite concerns that we don't lose sight of what it is. And I want to make sure that we don't cut short our public services because we're sitting on a mountain of cash because we're afraid that that cash is going to be given back. And I tell you, if you sit there long enough and don't think it's yours and somebody else thinks it's theirs, don't think they're going to ask and you're going to wind up giving it back because you don't spend it.
2 more items and I'll turn it.
But we'll take public comment after.
Oh, okay, I'll just go through my list and I'll ask Julie if she has some more detail. So with regard to, but to finish up with regard to PILs, there's none of it has been held back as far as reserves in another fund. It's all general fund revenue. It's just a treatment of, do we decide to accrue that in one year versus another accounting period. That's all it is, but, and we can have that discussion further. Coordination Council, at the council and at the budget committee, we've had discussions about how to be more active in that realm and perhaps share with Modoc County one of their staff member that they have doing that. Modoc's very interested in that because of course they don't have a lot of funding either. So I've included only $17,500 in the Coordination Council budget, which is a new budget unit we put in here. Based on last night's discussions, I'm going to change my recommendation to increase that a little bit, maybe to $25,000 or $30,000 in hopes that we can get a part of his time and then use part of our community development or building staff's time to do that function. So I'll be making that recommendation prior to our hearing
If you don't, yeah. I think it might be better realistically to see if you can swing it to like, 40, because if we do a thing with Sean, that might be 25, and then it leaves a little bit of money for like, help with the minute taking and some other
Okay.
incidentals.
Okay. I'll note that. The last,
With Bob sits on that with me.
Yeah, I think that's okay, but I also, our staff person that we're including did it sort of,
Yeah, 40 at the maximum.
okay, we'll fine tune it a little bit, and
Yeah,
I need to meet with her.
The 25, whatever, we'd be having to adjust it again.
Somewhere between 25 and 40.
Yeah.
The other significant issue that I don't know that we need to address today, but I do want to address is the Criminal Justice Facility Trust Fund versus the Courthouse Construction Fund. And that Courthouse Construction Fund is a fund that certain portions of certain court charges goes into. It's my understanding that sometime way back when the county got legislation passed, Lassen and LA County, I believe, that allowed them to transfer funds from the Courthouse Construction Fund to the Criminal Justice Facility Trust Fund for the purposes of allowing that money to be used for not only courthouses, but also things like jails, juvenile halls, and other criminal justice related facilities. We're in the process of exploring if that is still the case. I think the auditor is very reserved to utilize that money for other criminal justice facilities because of some information they've gotten from the state. So we've kind of sequestered that money in that fund. There's about $700 and some odd thousand in there. If we can determine that we can transfer that money to the Criminal Justice Facility Trust Fund, I would recommend that we use that to fund things like the switchboards in the jail. And if we can find that out, I'll be bringing back a revised recommendation. But Julie may want to go into a little more detail, and then we can take it wherever you want to take it.
Thank you, Bishop.
I'll just address a couple procedural items. Richard covered mostly everything in the memo that I have in the binders. We were in production last Thursday to get these to the board, and I see on here we had the public hearing on the memo at August 5th. It is posted in the paper for August 4th at 9:15 in the morning, so that's a Monday morning, not August 5th, so I wanted to point that out. So if you want to cross the 5th out on your memo and put the 4th. Richard touched on some of the things that were in here, such as the Honey Lake, the money for the pool, abatements. There is on the very bottom of that first page of the memo also, if you want to cross out or line out where it says the economic development budget, it actually should say natural resources budget. So the money for the economic development strategy planning is budgeted currently in the natural resources budget, not in the economic development budget.
Which line is
At the very bottom paragraph of the first page, just.
it? Natural resources.
Uh-huh, yep. Richard talked about what's budgeted in the ACO fund and what's projected to be transferred out, and touched on some of the capital projects that are budgeted in the Fund 150, if you're looking for that one. He touched on the vacancy factor. that was based on what we looked at for the last 3 years as the trend, so. There are some other things, on the second page after my memo, I've laid out, is similar to what the board has looked at in the past, kind of what some of the strategies we used to put the budget together, where the monies came from, whether they were one-time, annual, or other. Some of those being listed